Nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritti sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vidashujjitam Purna Prema Rasotsaho Jalamano Vritti Prasannananam Shashvat Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Mudake Dato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namo Mahavalanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Nama Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohana Kuladi Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sivak Raghunath Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gosvami Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Adadana Strinam Dantair Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisam Janma Janmani Raganugami Bhajano Lasanam Manasanam Shiradhaya Sahasmara Sahasra Smaratam Brajendhum Sri Rupa Pada Kamalashita Chetasam Me Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatu Pada Padme. And in praise of Padyavali, Yaram Yanikidagha Sangha Shamani Shutra Tritim Sangata Yasadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajenda Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his sorry, just muting that. By the grace of Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava Acharjas, the fulfiller of his heart's desires, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again, today we'll continue our discussion of Padyavali. And today we will continue our discussion of the Tṛṇād sunīcena verse, and we'll come to the second of the four qualities that we'll discuss in the verse, namely the quality of amāninā. So in the last class we concluded our discussion of mānadena or mānadena, and we went over a gradation in the degree of honor that is to be offered to all fit recipients of honor, according to their variety of characteristics, as well as something about the practical manner in which that honor is to be expressed. So now we'll move to amāninā. So you have the file. I'll just read from the beginning of this second heading. The next quality described in the verse under discussion is that of non-conceitedness, amāninā. The Bengali explanations of this quality in Chaitanya Charitamrita are as follows. One should personally be free from conceit, nirabhimani. Even while being exalted, a Vaishnava should be free from conceit, nir-abhiman. The Sanskrit commentary on Chaitanya Charitamrita attributed to Sri Chakravarti Pad also explains this quality in the same way. Sri Rupa Pad speaks of this quality of non-conceitedness, or amāninā, similarly in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Quote, non-conceitedness, even in the case of being exalted, is called, and it's more or less a tautology, conceitlessness, or man-shunyata. So to be without man is the same thing as being a man, or non-possessed of man. So maybe I'll just say a little bit about this word. In the previous verse, the word was mānadva, and here we have amāninā. So you had mānada, giving man, and here you have a man, or an absence of man. So in the previous explanation of mānadva, it was said that mānadva meant giving man, or giving honor. So now here, it is being said a man, or there is someone who is without man. So the sense here is not precisely honor, but a sense of being honorable, or a sense of being of importance or greatness. And by conventional meaning, or rather by the acquired connotation of the word within certain usages, the word man also alludes to a sense of honorability in the sense of pride, or a sense of conceit. In other words, thinking oneself worthy of respect, or expectation of respect, thinking one ought to be shown respect. In other words, to have conceit, or an excessively large excessively large sense of the degree to which one is honorable. So thus, from that, rudhi artha, or that like acquired common applied meaning, the idea of man here refers to conceit or pride. So amāninā is then an absence of conceit, or an absence of pride. So amāninā is non-conceitedness, or man-shunyata, being possessed of an absence of conceit. And we'll get a little bit into more about this sense of the root man later in the commentary. But for now, just as a preview, the first explanation is given here in following the explanation given in the Charitamrita. So you can see that in these two explanations given here in the Charitamrita, amāninā was explained as near abhiman. So abhiman abhi is a prefix which can convey height or being above. So abhiman means an excessive sense of man, or an excessive sense of one's own importance or honorability or value. So in other words, conceit, or can be arrogance or pride in a negative sense. So near abhiman is then the negation of that, or to be free from conceit. So because the Charitamrita renders the meaning of abhiman as near abhiman, as amani as near abhimani, then the initial discussion of the meaning of abhimani is in light of, or following, that manner of interpretation given by Kaviraj Goswami Pad. And I've given here a reference to the Sindhu, where Rupa Goswami also speaks about the same quality, the same concept, using a different word that's built from the exact same root. So it's clear that both in Kaviraj Goswami's explanation of this verse, as well as in Rupa Goswami's explanation of Bhava Bhakti, this is an essential point. So to illustrate this quality of non-conceitedness, Rupa Goswami in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu cites the following verse. Quote, holding rati, that is Bhava Bhakti for Hari in his heart, this crest jewel among kings, that is Bhagirath Maharaj, went to beg alms at the homes of enemies and bowed down even to dog cookers. So this is literal. A dog cooker, more practically speaking, means someone who in the context of that society was uncultured, or a bit of a ruffian, or a person who didn't follow scriptural guidelines. largely due to being brought up in a home and community where they weren't part of the education that, or the ethos of the community. So, Bhagirath Maharaj is an exalted Vaishnava king, highly shastric, and yet he's going and bowing down even to people that are the least cultured people of the society over which he rules. So this is said to be an illustration of being free from any sense of conceit. Although he is in fact worthy of great honor, just as Sri Rupa Gosvami or Kaviraj Goswami is saying, even while being exalted, a Vaishnava should be free from conceit. So even while he truly is exalted and worthy of honor, he still shows respect to persons of, who might be on the social spectrum the least fit to receive a significant degree of honor, although, of course, everyone is due a certain fundamental degree of honor, as we've now discussed in detail, and as this act of Bhagirath Maharaj is also illustrating, that these uncultured persons are also pervaded by the presence of Bhagavan, so he's also showing the quality of mānadena in this case. But to beg alms from enemies, to bow down to the uncultured, these are generally unthinkable for a tough kshatriya who, especially kings and royals are thought to have a very strong sense of ego in a healthy/unhealthy way, where it's on the border of a healthy sense of ethics and dignity and importance, going into a sense of, we're going to do whatever, we're all capable, we're going to achieve whatever it is we set out to do, and it can be healthy and admirable. It can also verge into arrogance and self-aggrandizement. And historically, and as well as throughout the Puranas, you see kings who show up somewhere on the opposite sides of the spectrum on that point. But in any case, this great Vaishnava king, he is bowing down even to enemies. He's begging even from enemies. He's showing that he has no sense of himself being, thinking he's something very great and due some very high degree of respect just because he's a king or a Vaishnava or what have you. So we'll get into details about this as we go, but this is the initial illustration, and I'll return to this illustration repeatedly throughout the discussion. So now, Kaviraj Goswami, Rupa Goswami have mentioned this point. Now we'll come to Sanatana Goswami's mention. Sri Sanatana Pad speaks of this quality of non-conceitedness as a primary characteristic of a bhakta in his Hari Bhakti Vilas. And the following verse from Srimad Bhagavatam, which he cites as an explanation of this quality, sheds light on the attitude with which an illustrious king and exalted bhakta like Bhagirath Maharaj could engage in begging it from enemies and bowing down to uncultured persons, as he was said to do in the aforesaid illustration given by Sri Rupa Pad. So now here Sanatana Goswami is citing from the Navayugendra Sangvad, the same section that these verses we discussed in the last class about the different acaryas of Bhagavatas were discussed. From that same section, another verse is cited here to illustrate this quality of being free from abhiman. Quote, "One whose sense of I adheres neither to this body nor to its birth, karma, varna, ashram, or jati is dear to hariḥ." I'll read that one more time, because this point is all pervasive, or in other words, as the conversation will unfold, spoiler alert, this principle is fundamental to every other virtue and every successful act of bhakti. So it's very important to understand. One whose sense of I adheres neither to this body nor to its birth, karma, varna, ashram, or jati is dear to hariḥ. Sri Sanatana Pad comments on this verse as follows. Birth refers to being born in a noble family. Karma refers to performance of austerities and so on, that is, and various other meritorious acts. Varna refers to being a brahmana and so on. Ashram refers to brahmacharya and so on. class refers to being born anulom, that is, in a mixed caste wherein the father is of higher caste than the mother. For example, as a murdabhishikta, that is, in the caste of those born of a Brahmin father and Kshatriya mother, or an ambashta, that is, in the caste of those born of a Brahmana father and Vaishya mother. One whose sense of I does not adhere to this body, even though it is possessed of such qualities, even on account of these aforementioned qualities, that is, high birth, meritorious acts, and so on. That is, one who has no conceit, such as, I am a member of a very great family, is dear to Hari, that is to be known as the best of Bhagavan's bhaktas. So one can be so dear to Hari without doing much. In other words, if one can just not do this, that itself will bring you very dear to Bhagavan. You don't necessarily need to go and achieve or do so many great things. If you can just do a little, almost nothing, a little tulsi, a little jal, like, just offer anything, but do it free from all of that, then really you are very great. This is the point being made. So, honor is typically given in the world in a conditional sense based on these things, based on being of a prestigious varna, a prestigious ashram, a prestigious class or ethnicity, based on having performed highly meritorious deeds, and so on. So if you're not born into something honorable, if you don't possess something that people honor, such as wealth, or you don't perform acts that people honor, such as winning battles or giving out rare knowledge or what have you, then you don't get any conditional respect. In other words, you don't stand out from others in any particular way, so people don't show you any special respect. So if someone has any of these or all of these, various qualifiers that make them stand out in comparison to people in general and make them worthy, in some sense, of a certain degree of respect, but yet still they don't identify with those things, still they don't consider, or they don't expect respect for those things, or they don't identify their real value or their real sense of self in those things, then they can be said to be free from conceit. And it's not just this list, but rather the list given in this verse in the Bhagavatam has an invisible etc. tagged on it, as Sanatana Gosvami explains. So, Sri Sanatana Pad also summarizes this quality as having no conceit based on possession of noble birth, learning, and the like. Sajanma vidya adimatsu nirabhimanita. And regarding the meaning of, quote, adi, or and the like, there are countless other aspects of worldly existence in regard to which one can foster conceit. In other words, guess what? You can get proud about just about anything. Qualities of the gross body, like strength and beauty, qualities of the subtle body, like intelligence and memory, qualities of character, like truthfulness, detachment, and determination, skills like acting and athletics, statuses like seniority and proprietorship, possessions such as money and property, and various other aspects of an individual's identity, such as one's sex, gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, and so on. In other words, people can find a way to become conceited about just about anything that they have. And this spoils whatever merit may also be present within them. Or maybe not entirely, but to a certain extent. We hear sometimes from Baba this story of two kings. But sadly, I'm not remembering their names at this moment. Anyway, two famous kings are coming with their entourage along the road, and then they both, encounter each other, and the road's only wide enough for one caravan to pass. So one caravan will have to come off the side of the road to let the other pass. So whoever's more honorable is the one who doesn't have to step to the side. So neither king is backing off the road, but both kings are thinking that they're the ones that must be the more honorable. And then is it Narada? Some sage happens to be present there, and he sees these two royal caravans, both, blocking each other. So he inquires what's happening, and he speaks to both the kings. And then he understands the situation, and he goes to one of them, I can't remember their names at this moment, and says, "You're the one that needs to step to the side." And then he says, and the king is surprised, and he says, "What? I've done such and such sacrifices, I've given such and such charity, I've, done this and that, I've done so many meritorious acts. How could this other king have done more than I have?" And the sage, he says, "Well, he hasn't really done more than you." And then the king is saying, "Well, then why should I have to back off?" And he says, "Because although he's done so much as well, he doesn't have any conceit about it. But you do. So because of your conceit in your meritorious behavior, that's disqualifying you. You're of lesser ultimate honorability. You'll need to pull off to the side." And then the other king is allowed to pass. So this illustrates the importance of nirabhimanita. And, in the classical society that we hear about in the Puranas, certain things were, primary features of being honorable and features around which people would develop a sense of pride. And in modern society, it's a bit different. Nowadays, if you're an athlete or you're a movie actor or you're just rich or you own a company or something like that, these are the things that most people tend to, think are great and become, arrogant about. So by reading these descriptions in the scriptures, we can understand that the sensitivity regarding conceit applies to these elements of modern society as well, if not all the more. So, to be free from conceit is thus to foster no sense of fundamental identification or sense of personal superiority to others based on any of these. In other words, you may be a great person, you may have done things that are very meritorious, you may have special skills or special knowledge or whatever that most people don't have, and that does make you worthy of honor. But even while you have those things, you don't become, as they say, puffed up, or you don't become expectant, or you don't demand that special regard is shown to those things just because they might be harbored in your person for a particular amount of time. And moreover, you don't necessarily attribute your acquisition of those things to your own merit, but you may consider, it's my good fortune that this has come to me. It's come to me by the grace of Bhagavan. It's come to me by the grace of my parents, my friends, my teachers, all the persons that have supported me in my life. So if I were to take credit and then expect to be rewarded for having acquired these things all on my own, that would be a disrespect to all the other persons that have contributed to the acquisition or the accumulation of those qualities or merits within me. So it would be unfounded of me to think that I alone am to be honored or credited for them, or that I ought to necessarily be shown excessive special regard in comparison to others because of that. If other persons had had the opportunities that I had, maybe they would have acquired all that and more. But maybe they didn't acquire the same opportunities that I had. So I'm not really superior to them. I'm just, in a temporary position of good fortune, which can also change in the course of life, and, roles can also reverse. So why should I become, acquire a sense that I am, fundamentally superior to another because of these things? In this way, there's a balance in one's attitude in regard to realistic understanding of what qualities and faults that one has, and a non-expectation of being treated with, special regard because of those things. In this way, it can be understood that because Bhagirath Maharaj had no conceit based on his being a king, being a bhakta, or any other special quality that existed in him, he did not feel himself to be superior to others. That is, he did not consider others inferior to himself, even though he had special qualities. Moreover, he consequently did not expect to receive any special honor from others, and thus did not feel unsettled in mind when he did not receive that. Rather, by virtue of his absence of conceit, he could remain equanimous in doing whatsoever he found to be required of him in the course of his service to Sri Bhagavan, and thus felt no qualms even about begging from the homes of those who fostered enmity towards him, or bowing down to persons considered to be the least cultured in human society. In this way, he demonstrated, as described by Sri Rupa Prabhupada, quote, non-conceitedness even in the case of being exalted. Sri Sanatana Prabhupada also later cites in Hari Bhakti Vilas another verse which mentions this quality of non-conceitedness, or amāninā. So this is from the Vishnu Puran. Quote, Vasudeva always dwells in the heart of one who is of pure mind, free from envy, tranquil, of pure character, like a friend to all beings, of pleasing and beneficial speech, and free from conceit and deceit. In his commentary on this verse, Sri Sanatana Prabhupada equates this quality of being free from conceit with that of being free from egotism, or nirahankarita. Moreover, he states that conceit is verily Bhagavan's maya, because of the predominance of egotism, that is conceit, in all faults, the underlying basis of all of which is avidya. And because of egotism, that is conceit, being the underlying basis of this entire mayic phenomenal world. So this is a very interesting comment. It's spoken in a little bit of a roundabout way within the context of the commentary. So I've given a slight explanation of it here. In other words, Sri Sanatana Prabhupada gives an explanation here that is parallel to the line of thought found in the aforecited fivefold categorization of affliction outlined by Patanjali in his Yoga Sutras, which begins, from a Gaudiya theological perspective, with the state of ignorance of the essential nature of the true self and Sri Bhagavan, and therewith a false sense of self that exists in the vacuum left by such ignorance. All faults in speech, thought, and behavior arise from identification with and conceit in regard to this false self. And thus, as long as one remains absorbed in such conceit, one remains enmeshed in the mayic world, and susceptible to behavior that is contrary to the best interest of the true self, and liable to result in offense to Sri Bhagavan. Srimad Bhagavatam speaks repeatedly of this bondage of the self within Maya as a result of egotism in regard to the body and so forth based on ignorance, with the term, quote, the knot in the heart, hridaya granthi, which Sri Sridhar Samipad glosses as egotism or ahankar, in the form of the tie between consciousness and matter. It is only when this tie is cut by the jiva, that the jiva can become free from Maya and attain the supreme Purushartha, Shri Krishna Prema. So, it's one's identification with the false self, in other words, one's clinging on to the false self, that, guess what, keeps one enmeshed in the false self. So one is enmeshed in the Mayic world because one identifies with it. So that egotism, or that act of identification, is thus what Sanatana Gosvami calls the underlying basis of the entire Mayic phenomenal world. And then when you act on the basis of a false sense of self, pursuing an object that was never in your true interest, then what's going to happen? Something that's not in your favor. Something that's not going to work out well for you. And it's going to result in behavior that's non-ideal, or rather that's faulty. So he says that there's a predominance of egotism or conceit in all faults, the underlying basis of which is ignorance. In other words, all faulty behavior is based on identification with a false self. A false self is fostered in the absence of knowledge of a real self. So when you have the absence, then you fill it up with some fake goods. And then when you act upon that fake thing thinking it's real, then you get yourself in trouble, or you act in a faulty manner. So in this way, this conceit, or this identification with the false self, is the fundamental basis of every fault that you perform, of every aparad that you commit, and is the fundamental thing that perpetuates one's involvement in samsara. So that egotism, or that conceit, that identification with the false self, is called the hridaya granthi, or the thing that's binding the jiva into the gross and subtle bodies. It's the thing that's keeping the jiva bound within this mayic embodiment, prohibiting it from, so to speak, going to Bhagavan. Of course, it would also take the will and the agency of the Sarup Shakti to bring that jiva to Bhagavan, but nevertheless, unless the tie is cut, that's not going to happen. So that aspect of the point is being emphasized here. So there's a statement here that Jiva Goswami cites in Bhakti Sandarbha, which, characterizes the implication of this principle. Quote, Keshava is not far from those who are free from egotism, but there are mountain ranges between him and those who are possessed of egotism. So the whole problem is there, so to speak. In other words, you don't need to become a superhero in human society. You don't need to go down in history as some great, pioneer of this or that, or champion of this or that. Right? If you can just disentangle from this whole thing, if you can just cease to perceive the apparent value of any of that, and no longer harbor any false sense of importance in the totality of these illusory exchanges or illusory statuses, then one is very close to Bhagavan, or one is ready to be brought to him, so to speak. But as long as one is actively identifying with and seeking achievement and aggrandizement in that plane, then it's like your mountain ranges away. In other words, all these challenges that we go through in life, people like movies about, heroes that climb mountains or win battles or, save the earth from natural disasters or, all these kind of things. But we can say that the journey to Krishna is the mountains that you have to overcome are not those kind of mountains. It's not that you have to go do a bunch of stuff in the world to reach him, but rather it's a lot of it has to do with disentangling from a lot of these things, no longer seeing those things as so big, learning that they're actually small, and letting go of one's attachment to seeking status, reward, acknowledgement, and so forth on those terms. So that journey, the journey of making so many attempts only to realize the hollow, shallow, ultimately unfulfilling nature of all of those worldly achievements, that's, so to speak, the process. In other words, you may have to achieve a bunch of worldly things to then realize that there's no real substance in achieving them. If you're just told that there's nothing to it, your attachment might not break. But if you actually get what you want, and you experience it, and then you find yourself still not satisfied, and then you desire something more, and then if you're lucky enough to achieve that, then when that's ultimately unsatisfying and the cycle repeats a few more times, eventually the vivek may kick in, and you may say, oh, actually, my pursuit of all of these things is the problem. So these, mountains that you cross, it's not that you end up at the top of the mountain and the music plays and you're glorious. It's like you end up at the bottom going, oh no, why was I bothering with all these mountains? In that way, you've crossed them, or you've realized that there's actually nothing up there worth climbing. Something like this is a little bit of a playful way of applying the implication of this idea of mountain ranges, but it may not be literally what's implied, but it's a way of going after the idea that one does well to dissolve this sense of egotism or this sense of conceit in one's worldly achievements or statuses. So let's dig into this a little further. Of all forms of egotism, that is conceit, the two most fundamental are those of conceit in the body and in one's actions. These two forms of conceit are also often integrated into the conceit of considering oneself an independently capable agent of worldly action, karta, or doer. Bhagavan Sri Krishna thus defines a fool in Srimad Bhagavatam as one whose sense of I is fixated on the body. And in Bhagavad Gita, he explains that neither he, nor the jiva, nor prakriti are fully responsible for the accomplishment of a jiva's actions. So, the Gita in particular spends a lot of time discussing this concept of the doer or the karta and giving teachings to disintegrate this concept that one is an independently capable doer. And if one can cease to identify and foster conceit in one's actions, that's, you could say, like the nucleus, that is the basis of conceit and pridefulness and behavior that leads to disrespect for others and ultimately aparad. That's the core nucleus from which all of that comes. People commit offense because they think that they don't need to show regard to whoever they're offending. They don't think they need to regard that other person because they don't think that they think that they're more important, or they think that they're independently self-sufficient irrespective of whether that person is treated well or not. So the whole tendency to commit aparad, which is the whole purpose of this discussion, this whole Tṛṇād sunīcena verse is a formula to heal one of the psychological tendencies for committing offense. The whole of the functioning of the mind that allows for any such behavior to take place intentionally is all rooted at its core in this sense of being an independently capable doer, of thinking I'm worthy, I'm independently capable of my actions, and therefore I'm to be credited for them, and based on all these actions I performed, I'm so sufficient, I'm so this, that I don't need to show any regard to, Bhagavan or the Murti or the Vaishnava or this or that or anything else. All of it stems from this conceit. So here in the Gita we find a core deconstruction of that conceit. We live in the world of, athletes seeking to achieve championships and medals based on themselves being the best, and, persons earning money and wanting, every cent that they earn to go to them, and, people wanting, patent rights on their own, intellectual property and credits for their books and, patents on their inventions and all these things. All, based on this idea that I am to be credited for the acts that I perform. And the irony is, but if you perform an act that you yourself don't think is honorable or that is embarrassing, then immediately you have 1,000 excuses as to why you don't need to be blamed for that, or you're not responsible for that. So when the act is good, then you want all the credit. When the act is bad, then it's anybody's fault but yours. This, hypocritical tendency is unfortunately common among fallen persons like myself. So this analysis that we'll get to right here in the Gita is how to deconstruct that entire dynamic by seeing that on no grounds is one an independently capable doer, and therefore one is in no way independently creditable for any action one performs. So how is that? The Gita, or here Bhagavan himself speaking in the Gita, says that every action is a combination of 5 factors. Number 1, the locus of the action, the body. 2, the agent, the karta, the jiva. The different types of instruments, that is the senses or the means within the body by which the action was performed. The various different functions within the body, those of the pranas, what enables the body to function in a loose, broad sense. And 5th, herein the divine, that is, the Paramatma, or the sanctioner of the action. Whatever action a person undertakes with the body, speech, and mind, be it right or wrong, dharmic or adharmic, shastra or non-shastric, These 5 are its causes. So any action that's performed, it's performed by a combination of spirit and matter, a combination of the jiva with a gross and subtle body, and it's made possible by the functionings of Prakriti animated by the Paramatma in the form of the pranas moving and the cycle of karma unfolding and the sanctioning of Bhagavan. All of these things contribute to any and every action taking place. This being so, one who sees, this is key, only oneself as the agent in this regard is ignorant, because of having an unrefined understanding and does not actually see. So certainly, the jiva, according to the Vedanta Sutra, is accepted to be a karta or an agent, and bears responsibility for the actions that are performed by the jiva. But that doesn't mean that the jiva is an independently capable actor. Rather, we could call it a dependently capable actor, or it performs action in concert with other factors upon which it is dependent, namely the Paramatma's support and the varieties of Prakriti that are, have taken different, forms and shapes to enable one to have a body, a mind, and so on and so forth. So to think that one is independently capable of action, to fail to recognize that there's a distinction between the self and the body, that the body and all the components of it don't belong to oneself, that they've been provided by Bhagavan, that they've been designed by Bhagavan, that they've been animated by Bhagavan, that everything you're doing is within a controlled environment that's all under the discretion of Bhagavan, that you're one tiny, tiny, infinitesimal little jiva moving around in a vast animation that's all regulated by Bhagavan, and then you're thinking, yes, I'm doing all of this. This is to see but to not actually see, or to fail to understand all the factors involved. So the key part here is to see only oneself as an agent. This is a misunderstanding. So he's not dismissing agency entirely, but he's dismissing a notion of independent agency. So to foster the attitude that one is independently capable of and fit to be credited for the action one performs with the material body is thus evidently a most fundamental and pervasive form of conceit. So here, how common is the attitude that we've already discussed, and so how pervasive is this very attitude, which is what this verse here of Mahaprabhu is saying one needs to be free from. So such conceit is the cause of the perpetuation of one's entanglement in the world of Maya and directly inhibits one from acquiring good qualities, such as the 4 taught in the verse under discussion, and properly following the path of bhakti. Sri Sanatana Pad thus concludes his commentary on the 4-sided verse from Vishnu Purana as follows. This is a very nice point. He says, in this way, furthermore, non-egotism or nirahamkarata, which for the purpose of our discussion is synonymous with non-conceitedness or amāninā, alone is shown to be the underlying basis of all good qualities. In other words, if you don't have this, you're not going to have any good qualities, actually. Maybe to some extent you might express sometimes, but they won't stick and they won't be genuine if this fundamentally is not there. So this is a very, very strong point. In one place he says, the presence of this conceit is the fundamental basis of your entanglement in the Mayic world. And the absence of this conceit is the fundamental basis of any goodness that exists within you. So how core is this? How central is this? We want to understand this very strongly, that this attitude, this degree to which one harbors this false sense of identification or is free from it, is exceedingly pervading or pervasively influential in the actions, the thoughts, the behavior that one conducts, and the success that one will find on the path of bhakti, or any path for that matter. For one who aspires to engage in Hari Kirtan and more broadly in any form of Bhagavad Bhakti, it is thus utterly imperative to be free from conceit, which amounts to both non-identification with any false sense of self, and therewith, now here's another important point, rightful identification with an ideal sense of self. So it's one thing to deconstruct what we don't want to identify with, but that leaves an absence. And every action is built on a sense of identity. So if we're going to deconstruct what we ought not identify with, we also need to have a concept of how shall we conceive of self. So a general understanding of a rightful ideal sense of self is expressed in a verse which occurs later here in Padyavali and is cited by Srimad Mahaprabhu as he addresses Sri Jagannath during the Ratha Yatra in Sri Puri Dham. Quote, I am neither a Brahmana, nor a Kshatriya, nor a Vaishya, nor a Shudra. I am neither a Brahmachari, nor a Grihastha, nor a Vanaprastha, nor a Sannyasi. Rather, I am an assisting servant of a servant of a servant of the lotus feet of the Gopis' Lord, the brimming ocean of nectar, filled with complete paramount bliss. So here in this verse we see the negation of the false self and an expression of identification with an ideal self. So if we remember that verse that we read in the Bhagavatam, and I say this here just in a minute, from the 11th canto, that one who's free from identification with the varna, the ashram, the jati, the birth, etc., that person is the greatest of Bhagavatas. We can take the first half of this verse as alluding to all of that. In other words, when he's saying, I'm not of this varna, I'm not of that ashram, the implication is that I'm also not identifying with any feature of the body. I'm not identifying with any other role that I play within human society. It's not that he's just negating varna and ashram there, he's negating all of these categories. And then he's identifying further in a positive sense. So, in this verse, conceptions of self based on one's varna and ashram are contrasted with a conception of self based on the jiva's essential nature or swarup and a specific form of spiritual aspiration. Since the jiva is said in a verse cited by Sri Jiva Pad and Paramatma Sandarbha from Padma Puran to be constitutionally, quote, a servant of Hari alone and never of anyone else. And the service of Hari that can be rendered to him by a jiva as an assisting servant of the servant of the servant of his foremost associates, the gopis of Braja led by Sri Radha, is the highest spiritual attainment any jiva can ever hope to attain. So this verse, here stated by Mahaprabhu, is excellent. In other words, it conveys, in one statement, a lot. It conveys both a complete disintegration of the false self and identification with the body, which is, as we said, the fundamental thing that enmeshes one in samsara, the fundamental tie that binds one to the world, and becoming free from which is the fundamental need in order to be a vessel of any merit of any type. So all of that is implied by this verse, and moreover, the idea of identifying with the nature of the jiva as a servant of Krishna, and then beyond that, identifying or aspiring to a sense of self which is integrated into, the ultimate lila of Bhagavan as a servant of his most intimate, most exalted parikaras, in other words, the ultimate positive sense of self that one could aspire to. Both of these things integrated into one statement, this is extremely valuable remark. So, by negating superficial conceptions of self, and therewith the conceit based on them, this verse cited by Srimad Mahaprabhu demonstrates the non-conceitedness, or nirabhimanitva, explained in the aforecited verse from Srimad Bhagavatam, of nonification with the body and its birth, karma, varna, ashram, and jati. Now, I'm just about out of time, but I want to add this one more point, because Jiva Gosvami, in his commentary on that verse in the Bhagavatam that Sanatana Gosvami cited, to illustrate this quality of nirabhimanita, Jiva Gosvami makes a very interesting point. So Sri Jiva Pad, in his commentary on this verse in Srimad Bhagavatam, reiterates the main points given in the aforecited commentary of Sri Sanatana on the verse, and then adds the following insightful extension of the sense, which also relates to the specificity of the spiritual aspiration expressed in the verse cited by Sriman Mahaprabhu. So this is in the Krama Sandarbha. He says, "One whose sense of I does not adhere to this body along with these," that is, its karma, birth, etc., the 5 elements listed in the verse, but rather, so here Jiva Gosvami is not only stopping at negating the negative, so to speak, but he's also making this point that in the absence of that false sense of self, or having negated that false sense of self, there should also be a sense of positive. There should also be a sense of identification with what one aspires to. So he adds in his commentary here, "Rather, one whose sense of self does not adhere to the body along with these, but rather adheres only to the body to be attained that is conducive to service to Bhagavan." So this is what he uses the exact phrase, "A Bhagavad Seva Upayogi Sadhya Eva Deha." So, which is another way of saying, to the Siddha Deha that one aspires to attain for the sake of serving Sri Bhagavan directly within his Leela, is dear to Hari, that is the best of Bhagavatas. So the complete extension of the idea is that if you're going to not be conceited and not have egotism based on a full sense of self, you should also have a clear sense of positive sense of self, and that should be both reflective of understanding of the jiva's essential nature, which is that of being a servant of Hari or a servant of Krishna, and moreover incorporate an aspiration for a particular form or a particular manner of service to Hari, which is dear to him, which is a form that he relishes and accepts, and that is part of his own, eternal Leela. So to complete or to have a full sense of quote-unquote non-conceitedness or non-egotism, one has to be fully situated in a healthy sense of self, or an ideal sense of abhiman or ego. And Jiva Goswami in Priti Sandarbha, he specifically uses the very word abhiman to speak about the sense of identity that Bhagavan's parikaras have. So the word abhiman doesn't always carry a negative connotation. It can also refer in a neutral sense to simply the identity or the sense of self that one fosters. So to be amani or nirabhimani, to be free from a negative sense of abhiman, the complete notion of that implies being cognitively attuned to a healthy type of abhiman, and that implies both attunement with the essential nature of the jiva and attunement to an ultimate form that can be attained by a jiva, which is known to be and accepted by Bhagavan as pleasing to him. In other words, that can be integrated into his eternal Leela and ultimately produce pleasure and joy for Bhagavan, which is, the very purpose, or which is the very spirit of bhakti or prema bhakti. So from this comment of Jiva Goswami, we get, the trajectory, if you will, that by freeing oneself from conceit, one frees oneself from all the psychological tendencies that lead to one committing aparad, and moreover, one gets, attuned to and focused upon what will, be one's ultimate highest, engagement or attainment, which leads to, the ultimate engagement that the jiva can achieve. So to integrate both of these things together will be the full notion of amanitva. So let's see. I guess I'll leave it at that for today. There's a little bit more on this concept, but I don't want to overdo it. So I'll pause here. In review, we've just discussed, we started our discussion of amanitva, or this state of being free from conceit, and we've gone through negating forms of worldly identity that ought not be identified with, and ultimately gotten to what should be ideally identified with. So if anyone has comments, questions, other types of feedback, feel free to share. Yes.
So my question is, thank you for presentation. How is it possible for Jiva that has been connected with the Prakriti, living Jagat for eternity? Actually, Vishwanath Thakur explains in his Sartha-darshini of Bhagavad Gita that Jiva and Prakriti have eternal relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So it's from this understanding and our own experience, is it any possibility of Jiva being completely diverted from this identification without on its own, by own its effort?
Well, we can say the Jiva on its own isn't capable of anything. It's, even its entanglement and its conditioning in Maya is made possible by its, so to speak, support or its collaboration, if you will, with the Maya Shakti. So, having, a subtle body that's thoroughly beginninglessly conditioned by vrittis of the Maya Shakti, the Jiva is utterly enmeshed in that, and the only prospect or means by which that will change is if the Jiva comes under the influence of Sarup Shakti. So, by sadhu sangha, by studying Shastra, by engaging in acts of bhakti, by coming in touch with all of the things that have the ability to attune the mind or condition the psyche in a way that's contrary to this beginningless conditioning with Maya, that will be the means, the only means. So, quote unquote, on its own, it won't be able to do that, it won't be able to do anything, but with the support of this higher agency, then it becomes possible.
Thank you. Yeah. Still, it's quite imaginable in this particular condition of Jiva to be able to do that, to be able to disidentify oneself from matter. Because from a concept of Jiva being completely identified with the body, mind, and intelligence, Jiva doesn't know anything other than that. So it requires complete reconstruction of that abhimana, complete, but strap everything and start new, which is actually the goal of spiritual life. Yet I'm just highlighting how difficult it is, how almost impossible to do it.
Well, the mercy of Krishna works wonders, or this is why it ultimately is faith, to have faith in the ability of Bhagavan's Chit Shakti, or the power of Sarup Shakti, to produce this change. This is one of the necessary eligibility, to take up the path. And it's, by no means easy, but it's what's prescribed, in every single day when, every sadhaka does their worship. Part of the worship is what they call bhuta shuddhi, or the purification of the elements of the worship. And as per our Goswami's explanation, the primary element to be purified in the worship is not the pradeep or the the plate or whatever. It's the mind, it's the self. So they've given these meditations of different types as far as how one can foster a sense of identification with an ideal sense of self, and that's integral to and to be done prior to performing any act of ritual worship. And the implication or the resonance of that is that to instill that sense of understanding, that sense of identity and aspiration is the ideal spirit of all of the sadhana that any sadhaka performs, and that to the extent that that sense of identity can be integrated and fostered and truly, identified with, that itself is a you could say a massive gain or success on the part of a sadhaka. How much they might do externally in a manner that appears socially important or socially sophisticated, in one sense is irrelevant. Maybe someone can't sing nice, maybe someone can't recite a bunch of stuff from memory, maybe someone can't do anything that really impresses anybody. But if they can do it with this, internal shift being made, they're way up there, beyond people who might, sing nice or, recite so much knowledge or, have some skills that people think are impressive, but who do it all, as an act of self-aggrandizement or with a largely still mixed, set of motivations and a lack of consolidated identification and use a strong affinity for that aspired for sense of self. So all of these things are the whole of the process of sadhana. This awareness in this teaching gives us a sense of balance of what are we actually cultivating, what are we actually trying to fortify within the mind, how can we measure whether our sadhana is having some beneficial outcome or not. This principle gives us an important parameter, an important balance point to reflect on. So it's very valuable. All right, well, let's conclude here for today, and we'll discuss the same topic a little further in the next class, and then we'll go into some further or an alternate interpretation of the word amāni, which comes from other commentaries on the verse under discussion, and then the conversation will ultimately integrate the two together. So the discussion of amānita will continue through the next class. So I'll leave it at that. Vaishnavibhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.